Yes. So on that note, let's get on with what we're doing tonight. And just so that we're all clear, this will be the last one for the year. I think as people get busy going in towards traveling and some other just holiday things, I'm going to set this aside until probably mid-January. We have the holidays, and then I'm taking a week of study leave and going to the annual meeting of the American Society of Church History, so that I can hear some cutting edge papers and 3 full days of history lectures and papers and roundtables. And that just makes my little geek heart smile.
Where is that?
Well, it's funny you ask, because it is in Philadelphia this year. I was going about every 3rd year, and I've given papers at this conference. But it's expensive, and I'm not really, as a full-time academic, I really can't go every year. But being in Philadelphia and being about 8 blocks from where my son lives means I have somebody to have dinner with while I'm there, and he may even go to some of the lectures with me.
Fun.
So let me mute us all, and then I'm gonna offer up a prayer and get started. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for bringing us back. We've seen each other in other contexts and other places, but this is a special time that we have. And so we thank you for this gathering. We thank you for the privilege that it is to learn and study and discuss and to explore your Bible at this very slow pace. We ask that you bless our time together and teach us what you would have us know. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So we're exploring the history of the Bible as a book, and we're paying attention to some of the content as we go through. And as I've been saying, we do this to deepen our understanding of how the Bible came to us, and also deepen our understanding of how God speaks to us. And so as we prepare to take our holiday break, I'm going to review a little bit of where we've been and point us in a direction. And then the part we'll talk about tonight will come at the end as we look at the chronologies of the Old Testament and how the books can be interrelated in certain places. So I haven't done the stats in a while. So the Bible, our Protestant Bible, has 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. The Old Testament comes from a Hebrew mindset and culture, and most of it was known in Hebrew, but there's a very strong tradition of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, being written in Greek as well. And as you hear me every Pentecost tell the story of Hellenization and Alexander the Great imposing a single language on the Western world, it's in that context that the Hebrew Bible became written in Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. The New Testament is written in that Greek, that same Greek that Alexander imposed on the world. It was called Common Greek. In actual Greek, it's called Koine Greek, which just means common. The New Testament, the Old Testament has been in its present form for since before the time of Christ. There have been some variations on that, but largely in that form. And the New Testament's been in its present form since about the year 120, even though it wasn't ratified by a council until a couple of centuries after that. And one of the threads that we've been following as we journey through the Old Testament is just remembering that a lot of the law and the histories of the Bible were edited and compiled into their present form during a time of exile. And as we read them with that in mind, we see how that impacts the stories that are chosen and how they're told, and some of the emphasis that certain things get, maybe in favor or at the expense of other things that we might not even know. The key to reading the Bible as it was intended is to make sure that we're always paying attention to the historical context of the things that were written. To read the oldest parts of the Old Testament with at least part of our brain understanding that these are Bronze Age oral traditions that were put down on scrolls some maybe 2,000-3,000 years ago. And so we want to make sure that we don't impose something on those texts, that those texts never were designed or written or compiled or edited to communicate. But the other thing is we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the not just the historical context, but the cultural context. Hebrews think in a different way. Hebrews think in, it used to be explained to me that Hebrews thought in circles. They thought in pictures where they surrounded an idea with poetry or with descriptions. And we're going to get after the first of the year to some, we'll spend an evening looking at the literary forms in the Hebrew scriptures and how they helped people understand them back then. And Greek culture ends up being more like our way of thinking. It's linear. This, then this, then this, then this, then this. For those of you who can read German, oftentimes you have these long sentences with all kinds of clauses and one verb at the end that tells you what all those clauses meant. That's a very linear way of thinking. That's a mystery to Hebrews. But paying attention to those things helps us understand the Bible that is at the heart of our faith. We've spent some time in the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is where you find the law. Genesis has those primeval stories of creation and the flood and the fall, the first sin, and also the Tower of Babel, which is probably the least taught of those 3 stories. The rest of Genesis is the history of the patriarchs. We talked in week 2 or 3 about a lot of the Old Testament being written with an eye toward how God's people were being governed at any particular time. And so in the garden, it is an immediate close relationship between God and Adam and Eve and their extended family. After a time, it's the patriarchs, it's the people after Abraham who are the hereditary heads of the family, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Esau and on down. And it's Jacob's 12 sons who become the parents or the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. In Exodus, we see the people of God freed from slavery, and that becomes one of the central stories for the Israelites. Again, that's because this was compiled in exile, and the idea of their nation being freed from bondage appealed to people in exile. And so it's why that important story becomes front and center. Not just for Jews, but for Christians. Exile is an important theme for not just for Old Testament believers, but for New Testament believers too. Leviticus, which is where Bible readers go to die, is oftentimes just a complicated list of laws and regulations and worship practices. But again, in exile, where they were in exile because they were disobedient, a review of the rules and the practices that God commanded them to do, that was important because it was a way of preventing the next exile. It was a way of being punished in that way again. After the people are released from slavery and find themselves in the land of promise, God asks them to have a census. Same way we do here in the US every 10 years, to have a census so that they could understand the size of the army they could put into the field. And then we get to Deuteronomy, which literally means the second law. the second teaching of the law. And Deuteronomy takes what is taught in Genesis, organizes it a little differently. And now this may sound strange for us because this book is 2,500 years old, but it updates the law. This is the slight modernization of the law. It doesn't change it, but it teaches it in a different way for people who are reestablishing their place in God's land. And so we talked about Joshua, and Joshua being the leader that carves out the territory that'll become the promised land. And we spent a whole evening on the Judges, which is an odd book because it's another different way of governing, right? God set up and called and empowered men and women to be judges who led the government, who administered the taxation, redistributed things so that everybody had enough, and sometimes led the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, into battle. The best one of those being a woman, Deborah, who when the men wouldn't lead, she was called by God to be the leader, and not only was the leader of the country, but led them into battle. And one of her lieutenants who ensured victory on that day was also a woman who snuck into the other camp and killed the opposing general. So these are sort of, they're graphic. I mean, she does it with a tent stake, after all. When I preached on that text, I brought a tent stake and set it in the pulpit. That was the quietest congregation I ever preached in front of. They were on their best behavior that day. But Judges tells these stories of how this confederation of 12 tribes, remember, they're not a unified nation yet. They are a confederation of 12 tribes bound by history and bound by their faith in Yahweh. That's really important for the chapter that we'll get into after the first of the year. Because up until this time and continuing right up until the time of Saul, who many of you already know about, the Hebrew people is not really a people. It's not really a nation. It's 12 tribes, each of them with their, and sometimes they clashed. But what unified them was their shared history and also their faith in Yahweh, in the one God, the monotheistic God of our Old Testament. And so that just reminds us about the path of governance in the Old Testament. I know that sounds like a dull thing, but it is the thread that holds these books together. In the garden, they're face to face. They have the patriarchs, then Moses, who is this great figure, and then Joshua, and then the judges. And the final judge who will bridge us to January is Samuel. Samuel is an interesting character, and we're going to talk about him in January. Samuel is the last of the judges and the first of the prophets that lead toward a monarchy. Just one note about Judges, the theme of Judges. Judges is a book that has this cycle of God's people obeying and being blessed and disobeying and being punished. And the teachings are rooted in that cycle. And somehow all the teachings in Judges are at some point in that cycle, any of the times that they move through it, of being blessed by being obedient and being punished for being disobedient. And again, that's no surprise because Judges was edited and compiled by a people who were being punished for being disobedient in exile. And so then we paused on these big stories, these big questions, and we spent our last time together in the book of Ruth. And apart from being just a really good story, Ruth is a reminder that of what it meant for the Hebrew people to live everyday lives according to God's covenants and God's laws. And so I won't tell the whole story again, but it's the story of a woman and two daughters-in-law who've all lost their husbands. They're making their way back from Moab, which is a neighboring nation to Israel. And one of the daughters-in-law turns around and goes back to her country, but Ruth has this declaration where she's going to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and that's where I'll be buried." The reason that story is so beautiful is Ruth is the first person that we encounter in the scriptures who chooses to be part of the Hebrew people. She's born in Moab. She's born outside the border, and she's not of Jewish blood. She's one of the first people who chooses to be a Hebrew. And the rest of that story is about the ways that the practical implications of the covenants that God made and the laws that God established impact this one family. She's widowed, but if there's a relative in her husband's family who can support her and buy her property, her inheritance and the inheritance of her children will be saved. And so it's almost like this is the micro story of God's covenant with God's people. And we know that Naomi creates this hatches this plot to get Ruth in front of one of the distant relatives of her dead husband. And she shows herself to be worthy of being his wife, and Boaz is the man. He falls in love with her and marries her, and he redeems her family's property, saves them from ruin, and gives Ruth a second chance at the life that she thought she was going to live with her first husband who had died. The reason that story of Ruth is so important is that and why it gets told still is that she's in the line of David. She becomes an ancestor of the greatest king in Israel's history. And not only that, by being in the line of David, she is in the line of Jesus. She is in the line of the coming Messiah. And so here's this little micro story about a widow who is completely dependent on the laws of her adopted faith and nation. And her life is redeemed through the rules, through the law. Ruth gets her second chance. Naomi gets a chance to be a grandparent when she thought that was taken from her. One of the cool details in the story is after Ruth has her son, his nickname is Naomi's boy, her mother-in-law's boy. So from Ruth, it's meant to show us what every day looks like under God's covenant, being faithful to God and being a blessing to other people. You see that multiple times, both of those in the course of the story. One of my professors wrote this about summing up the story of Ruth. He said, "Through their faithfulness and God's hidden guidance, this family was preserved for Israel, which is no small matter, for from it stemmed David, and many generations later, David's greater son," meaning Jesus. So that's where we find ourselves next, in the run-up to the story of David and how he takes the throne and how he becomes the king who has God's own heart. There's so much about David. David is a rich and complicated story. It has everything any soap opera might have. And yet it is this crucial story about someone who's credited with writing a fair chunk of Israel's worship language in the Psalms, somebody who unifies the country from those 12 tribes and finally brings them into a unified nation, and yet commits adultery, he commits indirect murder, his family is an absolute mess, and with serious consequences for the future of the people of God. And that's where we're headed when we reconvene in January. We'll save that for the new year. Today, I want to spend the rest of our time talking about the timeline of the Old Testament, because the Bible has an order, but that order is made up of groupings of different kinds of literature. It's not chronological. And so coincidentally, Genesis tells the story of the beginning, and it's there, right there at the start. And Malachi is, in fact, chronologically the last prophet of Israel before the period of silence that leads up to the time of Christ. But in between, the order is all cattywampus. Is that a technical term? Yeah. And so I want to talk just a little bit about that, because one thing that will help us as we continue after the break is to see the way the Old Testament develops over time. We've talked about how the text moved from oral tradition to a written tradition. And we've talked about the role that the exile plays in influencing and organizing the Hebrew Bible. And we've talked about the way also that the exile influenced how the stories were edited and ordered, and the way that the exile becomes a theme in the scriptures. Tonight, I want to look a little bit about the relationship between the historical timeline and the order of the books, because I think this is something that helps us understand what we're reading in its context. When we read it, is it a prophet for a later king or an early king or no king at all? Or where are we in Israel's story when we read about a particular prophet? So I'm going to put up a little chronological order handout, and we're going to talk about this for just a bit. So eventually this will have the Old and New Testaments on it. But notice up here, Genesis in its form is an old book. Now, it has the oldest writings in it. It's in its present form, it's actually compiled later. But the stories that are in it are, in fact, the old, the primeval stories that God's people told just as they were coming into being. And I don't want to spend too much time haggling over whether or not these are historical stories. I don't think they are. I don't think the creation story is as much about how it happened as it is about why it happened. That God is this creative being, and creation and the handing off to us of creation is a part of God's, the way God is living God's plan. But notice that the second oldest book in the Old Testament isn't the second book of the Old Testament. It's Job. Job and Genesis are probably contemporaries of each other. Job is an old story. And what it is, and we'll talk about it when we get to Job, but Job is what's called a theodicy. I'll spend more time on this later. Theodicy is a little corner of theology where it talks about making the case for a loving God in the presence of evil and suffering. And so Job, as you know, is a story that doesn't make much sense to us now, because it appears that God and the devil are placing a bet on a human. And God says, well, you know, the devil character says, people only follow you because you give them stuff. And God says, well, no, I've got faithful people. Like, look at that guy, look at Job. And they make a bet, and it leads to this calamity for Job. And Job spends most of the time either grieving or being comforted by three ham-handed, ham-fisted friends who don't really get the story right in the way that they're comforting him. But in the end, Job stays faithful, even though Job challenges God. There's a point where Job curses the day he was born, and he says, that my whole existence has been a mistake. And God's line to him is, stand right there and take this like a man. I'm just telling you right now, none of us want God to say that to us. But Job is a story that's meant to explain to ancient people, 1,000, 2,000 years maybe before, maybe even more than that, before the time of Christ, to explain why believing in God isn't eliminated or made redundant somehow or obsolete in the presence of suffering. That you could still believe and trust in a good and loving God, even in the presence of suffering. That's a hard lesson that we all are still trying to learn. And so it is literally probably the oldest book in the Bible. And so then, the rest of these you see, they tell the story in a way that we're familiar with: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. And so some of these are put in chronological order, but I'm going to put up another slide because I think it's important for us to see where the prophets line up with the kings. Because remember in the story, we haven't really gotten to this part yet, but from Sundays, as we've talked about it, or from our time in Amos, that there were prophets that were assigned to different kings. And they're not in the order that they are in the Bible. The Bible has practical concerns. It's trying to create evenly sized scrolls. And so you have the big prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and maybe Ezekiel, and then you have the rest, and all of those are sort of balanced out in the scroll tradition. So at 800 BC, we are after the time of David and Solomon and the first, I think, of the kings, maybe one of the, am I getting this right? Rehoboam? Yeah. But let's just say right here, picking up the story at the year 800 BC, remember the kingdom has split from north and south. And in the northern kingdom, which is the kingdom of Israel, you have Jeroboam II. Well, the prophet to him is Jonah. And look at this, Amos is right here. And you'd never know it from looking at the way they're placed in the Bible, but Amos and Hosea overlap. And that's just the prophets to the northern kingdom. In the southern kingdom, which was a lot more treacherous, kings are being murdered by their firstborn sons so that sons can take the throne. And you have you have Joel, who shows up towards the end of the Bible, actually being the oldest of the prophets. And then moving on down here into these other kings that you can read about, oddly enough, in 1st and 2nd Kings. You have Micah and Isaiah. I would never have thought of them overlapping and speaking during the same time. And Hosea, not just being a northern kingdom prophet, but also a southern kingdom prophet. So you have Isaiah, who is really the giant of the Jewish prophetic tradition, working right alongside Micah. Most of us really only know Micah 6:8, right? To love God and love God, do justice and mercy, and walk humbly with your God. I can't remember what it is, but you know what I'm talking about. Micah is a short, relatively short prophetic book, and yet it covers, it crosses over 3 monarchies. And so Nahum, which we hardly ever read, it covers a fairly large period of time. That's more than 40, that's more than 30 years, 36 years right here. Nahum is the primary prophet for the southern kingdom. Now, who knows why this is all blank right here? Because the northern kingdom falls in 722 BC and is taken into exile and is never heard from again. The lost tribes of Israel were right here. But but here you get to the end of these kings, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah rediscovers the law. Notice there's 3 prophets that served King Josiah. We're going to get to a great story about him. And then notice over here, there is no northern kingdom. Blank space over here. But the southern kingdom continues until it is taken into exile. And there are prophets then that bridge the gap between being in Judah and being taken to Babylon in exile, and then prophets that speak to the Hebrew people in exile, and then you get Malachi here at the end. Now, the other day I watched one of my guilty pleasure movies that I can watch all the time. It's hyper violent. It's called 300. And it's the story of 300 Spartans who held off the Persian Empire when they were trying to invade Greece. It's Xerxes the First. Xerxes the First is the king that the Spartans, they don't defeat them, but they hold them off for 3 days, which rallies all of the Greek city-states to unify and within a couple of years to defeat Persia and drive them out. The reason I'm harping on him is that Xerxes, in another Hebrew tradition, has a different name, and it turns out Xerxes is Ahasuerus, and he's the king that Esther is married to. So I realize this is all a jumble and these are strange names and things, but this is helpful to me to see where the prophets fit in the timeline of Israel's history and world history at the time. And so at the end, I'll share this and make sure that this is all available to us. But I think I'm going to leave that one. That one's way more complicated. But I do that as a way for us to kind of close off this segment before we take our break, that the chronology of history and the order of the books has some complexity to it. And that's going to be helpful for us as we look at which prophet is speaking to which king and why that matters. And so the Old Testament is proving to be an interesting collection of stories that are the foundation for the faith that is in play and in practice at the time of Christ. We're seeing it develop from a largely family-oriented faith in the second part of Genesis to a more tribal nation that is not really unified. It's actually called a confederation of states, of tribes. We're going to begin next year by seeing how the 12 tribes are unified into a nation. and what that means for God's people, not just for God's people, but also for their relationships with the nations around them. And so I'm going to open it up for questions. I know this is kind of a different evening for us, but I'm going to ask you all to unmute. You all see that? There you go.
We're unmuted.
Roger.
Thank you.
Just so you know, my reading during the break to prepare for this is the birth of the monarchy, the first 31 chapters of 1 Samuel. That's my light reading for the break.
Oh, can I have it after you?
Here's the thing, you all have it,
That's
right? You all have 1 Samuel. It's not our go-to book probably, but
that could be by Donald Trump.
oh, easy now.
Question.
So first off, let's break this into two things. Any comments kind of on where we've gotten to up to tonight, not counting the chronology question? Are we feeling pretty tight on what we know or are starting to know about the development of the Old Testament? Just, it's okay. We're not doing it in Hebrew. We're not doing it the way, Bible scholar geeks do it. We're doing it the way church people do it. We're learning the parts of this that are important for our own reading. Why? Because the Bible is where we go to figure out what it is we can know about who God is.
Would you mind mentioning why the minor prophets were in the place in the order in which they were placed?
Yeah, I think that's what I was talking about with the scrolls, that the Old Testament, when it was handwritten in rolled scrolls, which may be redundant, they kept the scrolls at largely the same size. So the four major prophets made up one scroll, but all the other prophets fit on the second scroll. And that's where you get terminology like the major and minor prophets. It's largely because of the size of the document.
Don't have to be pretty big scrolls.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you had Isaiah, Daniel, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel on one scroll, that's a big scroll. But then I don't know how many more.
Lamentations?
Lamentations, I believe, is one of the writings and not considered a prophetic book. It's part of the wisdom literature. It goes with Song of Solomon, and I mean, it's that bigger grouping of writings that we're gonna spend a couple of weeks on wisdom literature, because it was the practical guide to faith living in ancient times. Ecclesiastes often gets put in there. Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, maybe even Proverbs. As I look at the list, I think that's Job is considered wisdom literature, even though it's probably 1,000 years older than some of the other writings. Somebody else had a question. Bert, please.
Well, this might be sort of esoteric, but it seems to me that we have this group of Hebrew people that escaped slavery, in which they wouldn't have been allowed to have weapons, presumably. So it seems to me that somewhere along the line, they acquired weapons and the skills to use them. How could this be?
That's a great question. I don't know the definitive answer to that, but again, I'll say these are Bronze Age stories. And so weaponry is not very sophisticated at this point. You have swords, you have spears. We all know from the movie that Egypt had chariots. And so it's infantry and cavalry. The Roman Empire doesn't grow its great army until the 1st century BC, 1st or 2nd century BC. And that's a good 1,000 years after some of the older stories that we're talking about here. And so, actually, I just read today, because I got on a little tangent about the Persian Empire and their invasion of Greece. At one point, the deciding factor in a battle was that one side had bronze weapons, which were older and less reliable, and the other army had iron weapons, which were stronger and more durable and more reliable and effective. And so we're talking about a time where the kind of metal you would use on the same weapon would determine how you fared in battle. Presumably, while there are great skills to be had with swords and spears and things, it's also a fairly self-explanatory weapon, right? A cudgel or a sword or a spear, you know what to do with those. And they just picked those up. You had to be able to defend yourself against robbers and things once they were out in the wilderness. Bert, you may have seized on a question that explains why God had them wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. It was to practice their swordsmanship. What else about those early books? I'm still taken with Ruth. I went back and read it again after I taught on it, which I don't usually do because, the only way is forward. But it's such a pleasing, interesting, hopeful story to read. And it doesn't require a lot of context background to understand it, although it helps to understand why all this kinsman redeemer stuff is important. But it's just such a charming story about a woman who is so committed to her new family that she chooses it and is welcomed into it fully. For all of our talk about, and there are places in the Old Testament where only the blood of people who had blood relationships to the patriarchs were considered Jews. This is a departure from that. And it is a broadening of God's grace, which is another thing we're going to talk about in the new year. The story of God's love for humanity grows ever wider. It is on a trajectory of widening, not narrowing, in the Old Testament and in the New. And we're going to look at one point at 3 texts, 2 in the Old Testament and 1 in the New, where that you can draw a straight line through those texts and see that God's door is getting wider, not narrower. That's a teaser for next year.
I read about another woman who was much less well known, not even in all the Bibles, Esther.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you talk about a cunning, fighting woman.
Well, Esther did all of her, whatever she did from behind the scenes. I mean, if we're talking about the same Esther, she's a queen, but she is a wife of the Persian king, but she is also part of the exiled Hebrew community. And so at the one point, her origins are all weakness because this is during the exile. But by marrying the king, she suddenly has access to power. And it's that access to power that allows Esther to thwart somebody who wants to kill all the Jews, who wants to kill all of the Hebrew people in that.
Well, this is Esther, and yeah.
Am I thinking of a different person?
I'm thinking about the woman who went and seduced a general and cut his head off.
Oh, no, yeah, that's not Esther.
No, no, it's not.
That's, I think her name is Jael.
Jail.
right.
Dale's one with a tent peg.
Oh, the one who cuts the head off. Yeah, you're right. But it's not Esther. And I walked to this house without my Bible, but somebody else can find that.
Well, it's in the Apocrypha, so you're not going to find it in every Bible.
Oh, okay. That's a different story then. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there's some there. I did a sermon once called "Two Women Not to Be Trifled With."
Sorry, Hitler didn't have an Esther.
Yeah, true story. You got Eva Braun instead, but yeah.
Yeah.
So are you guys curious, or is there still some ambiguity, or are you feeling good about the whole discussion of the chronology and how the order of books is different than the order of history, the chronological order? I think we'll keep pointing that out as we go. And it's not something I emphasized when we went through Amos last year, but it's part of the story of Amos. Amos was a prophet. If you were how many people were here for Amos? Yeah.
Yeah, we got
So,
part of Amos.
remember that Amos in the 7th or 8th century BC was from Judea, the southern kingdom. Or is that Judah? I think I just fast forwarded the name there. It's Judah. From Judah in the southern kingdom, called to be a prophet to the king of the northern kingdom. And it matters, that period. It matters that he is from the southern kingdom, which at that point was doing well, and that he was one of the last prophets to go up and prophesy against the king of the northern kingdom before they were taken into exile. And then I showed you that long white empty column. That's the northern kingdom from the 8th century BC on. There is nothing there. It's occupied territory. It's the people, the inhabitants were spread out over the world. And it's the stragglers who came back and tried to piece together an imperfect practice of the Hebrew faith, who are the Samaritans that are the hated people in the New Testament.
Yeah. John,
Yeah,
question.
sure.
Could the pattern that you see in the ancient Hebrew Bible, could that be a product of their language? In other words, language gives us a way of thinking. And, it strikes me that it would make entirely good sense that the Hebrew language produced a certain way of organizing things.
Yeah,
And, and then, when we get into a different time period where a different language dominated Greek, of course, then you see a different pattern of thinking, putting things together.
yeah. You'll notice that if some of the teachings, the instruction on how to be the people of God in the Old Testament sounds a lot different than the way Paul describes it in his letters, right? And so even though we read it in English, we read those, they present to us as the same language, but they come from such different languages and different cultural understandings of all those things that, and as English speakers, so English rooted in Latin and German and some French, and Greek, we align the New Testament makes more sense to us. the concepts of the New Testament make more
Yeah.
sense to us because it's the way our brains think.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
the harder struggle sometimes is to read the Old Testament for all it's worth. Because sometimes it's tough to grasp for us, even though we see it in English.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
That's what I want. I want a bunch of, I'll think about that. That's a good thing. So I said it at the beginning, but I'll say it again now that everybody's here, that we're off now for the rest of this year. We'll start up again after I get back from my short study leave in January. So I would figure on looking for a notice of resuming in middle of January or so, whatever one of those Tuesdays looks like. And I'll be full of all kinds of church history anecdotes from our conference, which I know will just thrill you all. But until then, sorry, Tad, please.
Will you post those 2 slides on the webpage?
Yes, I'm gonna remember to do that right when we're done here. I'll send those to Kenneth and he'll put them on the church website where the recordings are. And yeah, that'll help. Those are good documents for us to look at. And very honestly, I just pulled those off of reasonably trustworthy sites on the internet today. Yes, but I'll get those up there.
Right.
So some announcements about the life of the church. 2 services on Christmas Eve, 5:30 and 7, both of them in the sanctuary, both of them live streamed, both of them will be recorded and posted. That's my soft way of saying no one has any reason not to watch at least one of the Christmas Eve services this year. Christmas falls on a Sunday. And we will be having a service. It'll be an informal service of worship. Linda Brady has graciously is going to be graciously sharing her talent on the piano, playing our Christmas songs. We will end with a time of taking requests for Christmas songs that you haven't heard enough during the season. That's what I mean by informal. This will be a different kind of service. We're going to encourage people with kids that if they want to come, bring their kids in their jammies. Why not? One time, it will not hurt us. And we'll have we will have church on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. So I know Pam has a congregational life event, a fellowship
Yes.
event to share.
Next Thursday at 6 o'clock. Whoops, I'm muted.
No, we hear you.
you're good. Okay, next Thursday at 6 o'clock, we're going to carol on the corner of March and Morrow for a half hour or so, and then have some refreshments. So please come. Love to hear you sing some Christmas carols.
Nice.
Yeah.
And since I know you all have your Thursday evenings free because you're usually here, come and sing with us.
I have an announcement.
Okay.
Monday evening, 7 o'clock, Zoom and in person at Nativity Catholic Church, opening doors for interfaith understanding. It's going to be Rich Carcel on the Sunflower, which is such an amazing book on forgiveness. And then an incredible Buddhist birth tea. So it's going to be very interesting, and we've had a great turnout lately. So come and let us see your real selves. 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Thanks, Luann. And I will say that even though we're part of the way through Advent, we still have some Advent readers, the devotionals in the office. If you want them, just send Kenneth a note or Jen, because they're there more often during the day. We still have those. They're $10. And I don't know if anybody been reading through those, even just a little bit. Yeah, good. They're wonderful little readings. This is my first time through this book. And
It's very good. Yeah, I
I'm
love it.
enjoying it. Good. I'm so
Yeah.
glad. Yeah, that's great. Any other announcements for the good of the order? I wish you all a blessed second half of Advent, and I'll see you on Sunday, and for the next couple of Sundays, and for Christmas Eve. So really looking forward to that too. But all around me here in Shell Beach, they're walking along Shell Beach Road. This is the annual Christmas open house, which I did not get to go to,
Oh,
but it looked like it was a lot of fun. And I think I'm going to make sure I go next year.
okay. John, breakfast at the Villages in the morning, 9
Yes,
o'clock.
I will be there, 9:00. Let me close us in prayer. God, we thank you as we do each week that we can gather for the privilege that it is to take this hour and to think and to study and to reflect and to ask questions about the scriptures that you've given us and the ways that they came about and the ways that they can continue to bless and shape and challenge our lives. We pray as we get deeper into this Advent season that you would give each one of us a sense of expectation and hope and longing for the coming of your Son. We pray this and all other things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, guys.